Hello, friends. A rule that millions of retirees have been living under for years just got flipped. Not adjusted, not slightly modified at the margins in a way that produces a rounding difference nobody notices. Flipped. The assumption that a significant number of retirees have been operating on, baked into how they understand their benefit, how they respond when their deposit changes, and what they believe their options are when something looks wrong, is no longer accurate. SSA changed the underlying rule, and the retirees who do not know about it are now making decisions based on a framework that no longer applies. The truth this flip reveals is the part that surprises people most. When you understand what the old rule actually said, what SSA changed it to, and what that change means in real dollar terms, the natural response is not confusion. It is the specific combination of clarity and frustration that comes from realizing something important was always available and nobody pointed at it until right now. I am pointing at it today. Stay until the very end. The last thing I cover is the group this flipped rule affects most deeply, and for those retirees, the surprise is not just that the rule changed, it is how long the old rule kept them from something they were always entitled to. And if SSA Now is where you come when you want to know what SSA changed before it changes what you believe is possible for your benefit, subscribe right now and turn on the bell. Let me start with what the long-held rule was and why so many retirees built their understanding of SSA around it. For years, the dominant assumption among retirees was this: the benefit calculation SSA produced at the time of filing was essentially final. The initial determination was the determination. Yes, technical avenues for challenging it existed, but the practical barriers, the evidentiary burden placed on the retiree, the complexity of demonstrating an error against SSA's own records, limited retroactive reach of any correction, made the process feel inaccessible enough that most retirees never attempted it. They accepted the number. They built their retirement around it. And they operated on the assumption that the number they were given was essentially the number they were going to get. That assumption is what SSA flipped. The first dimension of what changed, the evidentiary standard for benefit calculation reconsiderations. Under the previous framework, a retiree who believed their benefit was calculated incorrectly faced a process that placed the primary burden of proof on them. They had to demonstrate the error. They had to produce documentation sufficient to override SSA's own records. The result was predictable. Most retirees who suspected an error never formally challenged it. The process felt too burdensome and too uncertain, and so the error continued running in their monthly deposit indefinitely. What SSA flipped is where the burden sits. Under the updated framework, a formal reconsideration request now triggers SSA's own obligation to actively verify the accuracy of the underlying calculation rather than simply defending the original determination. The retiree identifies the concern. SSA verifies. The old rule made the retiree the investigator. The new rule makes SSA the verifier. The dollar impact is significant. A benefit running $75 per month below the correct amount for 5 years represents $4,500 in cumulative underpayment. Under the flipped rule, the retroactive reach of any approved correction extends back to the date the reconsideration was formally initiated, meaning the sooner that initiation happens, the more retroactive ground the correction covers. Call SSA at 1-800-772-1213 today and ask to initiate a benefit calculation reconsideration. Tell them you want SSA to verify the specific earnings years incorporated into your calculation and the indexed values applied to each one. Before you call, log into ssa.gov and note any earnings years where the figure seems lower than your actual income from that period. The date of that call is the date your retroactive clock starts. Every day it goes unmade is a day the window does not cover. Drop a comment right now and tell me if you have ever suspected your benefit was lower than your working history should have produced, but never formally challenged it. What stopped you? I want to understand how many people in this community have been living under the old rules assumption without knowing it just got flipped. Second dimension of what SSA flipped, how the agency handles Medicare premium surcharge appeals when the qualifying event occurred more than 12 months before the appeal is filed. Under the previous framework, SSA's guidance around SSA 44 appeals treated the timing of the filing as a meaningful factor in how the appeal was evaluated. Appeals filed well after the qualifying event were subject to heightened documentation requirements and reduced likelihood of full approval compared to appeals filed closer to the event. What SSA flipped is the treatment of timing in this evaluation. Under the updated guidance, the qualifying event remains valid as the basis for an SSA 44 appeal, regardless of how much time has passed, provided the surcharge was generated by income from the event year and the retiree's current income is demonstrably lower. In practical terms, this means retirees who retired 2 or 3 years ago watched their income drop and have been paying an IRMA surcharge generated by their final working year income ever since without challenging it because they assumed the appeal window had closed, may now have a valid SSA 44 appeal available under the flipped timing standard. The surcharge running for past months is not recoverable, but the going forward correction is permanent. For a retiree paying a $200 or $300 monthly surcharge that should not be there, a going forward correction represents thousands of dollars over remaining retirement years. Download SSA 44 at ssa.gov. Document your qualifying life-changing event with specificity: the date of retirement or income reduction event, the source that ceased, the evidence your current income is substantially lower. File it with complete documentation under the flipped timing standard. Follow up with SSA after submission to confirm the appeal entered the correct review queue under the updated guidance. Third dimension of what SSA flipped: the rule governing how survivor benefit amounts are reviewed when a surviving spouse returns to SSA more than 24 months after their initial election. Under the previous framework, survivor benefit elections were treated as essentially binding after a 24-month period from the initial election date. A surviving spouse who later discovered the alternative option would have been more favorable faced significant procedural barriers after that window. The old rule communicated, implicitly if not explicitly, that the election made at the time of loss was the election that stood. What SSA flipped is the finality of that barrier. Under the updated rule, availability of a benefit election review is no longer tied primarily to time elapsed since the initial election. It is tied instead to whether the election was made with documented evidence that both options were clearly presented and compared before the decision was recorded. This flip is enormous for surviving spouses who made their election without a clear side-by-side comparison, which under the previous counseling practices describes a significant portion of surviving spouses currently collecting. If you were handed a number and told, "Here is your benefit," without a clear explanation of the strategic alternatives, the flipped rule creates a basis for requesting a review regardless of how long ago that election occurred. The survivor benefit at full retirement age is up to 100% of what your deceased spouse was receiving,
including any delayed retirement credits they accumulated. The difference between an election made without this comparison and one made with it can be several $100s per month permanently. Call SSA at 1-800-772-1213 and ask specifically for a survivor benefit election review under the updated documentation standard. Tell them you want to know whether your initial election was documented as an informed comparison between both available options. Request that both your own retirement benefit estimate and your full survivor benefit amount be presented side by side with the implications of each strategy given your current age and full retirement age. Fourth dimension of what SSA flipped, and this is the one I told you to stay for: the rule governing how cost of living adjustments interact with corrected benefit amounts when the correction results from an approved reconsideration. Under the previous rule, when a reconsideration produced an approved correction, the cost of living adjustments applied to the incorrect lower amount during the period of the error were not retroactively recalculated against the correct base. The correction moved the benefit to the right number going forward, but the COLA history built on the wrong base was not addressed. What SSA flipped is how the corrected base interacts with future COLA calculations. Under the updated rule, the corrected benefit amount becomes the base for all future cost of living adjustments. This means a correction that increases a monthly benefit by $80 produces not just an $80 monthly improvement immediately, but an $80 higher base from which every future COLA percentage is calculated permanently. Over a 15-year remaining retirement, with annual COLAs averaging 2 to 3%, that compounding produces a cumulative difference significantly larger than the immediate monthly correction suggests. This flip makes initiating a reconsideration more valuable than the immediate correction amount alone indicates.
The retiree who receives an approved correction is not just receiving more today, they are receiving a higher base from which every future adjustment will compound for the rest of their life. Here is what connects every dimension of the long-held rule SSA flipped. Every flip moved the system in a direction more favorable to retirees who take action. The evidentiary burden shift makes reconsiderations more accessible. The timing standard flip for SSA 44 opens the door for retirees who assumed it had closed. The survivor benefit election review removes the time barrier that kept surviving spouses from accessing a comparison they were always entitled to, and the COLA interaction update means every correction approved going forward is more valuable in lifetime terms than the same correction under the old rule. But every flip requires action. SSA moved the rule. SSA did not call the retirees the change favors and explain what moved and what to do about it. So here is what to do right now. Call SSA today and initiate a benefit calculation reconsideration if your benefit has ever felt lower than your earnings history deserved. Download and file SSA 44 if you have been paying an IRMA surcharge from a qualifying event year that no longer reflects your income. And if you are a surviving spouse who made your benefit election without a clear comparison of both options, call SSA and request an election review under the flipped documentation standard. A long-held rule just got flipped. The truth it reveals has been sitting there the entire time. Now you know where to find it. If SSA Now gave you the truth today that SSA never volunteered, subscribe to this channel and turn on the bell. Every rule SSA flips, every assumption that no longer applies, every door the change opens, I bring it here before the old assumption costs another month. And share this video with every retiree you know right now. The flipped rule applies to their account too. I will see you in the next.